Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. Story number 1. I was 3 years old when I was diagnosed with a severe fever of unknown origin. As the fever worsened, I had fits, my eyes rolled back in my head, my body became covered in sores, my tongue blistered, and I eventually passed out. Over the course of 14 days, I alternated between conscious and unconscious states. We lived in a very small village in Europe and had no access to hospital care, despite the fact that our family doctor came every day. My family, practicing Roman Catholics, had the village pastor perform final rites as I approached death, called extreme unction at the time, now known as anointing of the sick. I went through a period of darkness at first. I believe this is when I first went unconscious. This was quickly followed by a wonderful floating sensation in which I hovered above my body before re-entering it. This occurred at least twice. My mother was crying, and my father sat beside me for long periods of time, looking tense and unhappy. Surprisingly, I saw and heard them all the time, not just on the rare occasions when I became aware. I became aware that there were 2 beings in the room with me at some point. They appeared to be made of almost transparent, pure white energy, but they appeared very solid to my young self. They caressed me, and one sat by my side of the bed at all times, while the other stood guard beside the door to my room. When people came to see me, the doctor, family, and priest, both of these beings stood or sat on either side of the door to the room. These beings comforted me and made me feel important in a way that I didn't understand. I was willing to accompany them wherever they desired. They indicated that the decision was mine. I had the impression that I had all the time in the world to decide what to do. I was constantly aware of both the real world and the plane inhabited by the beings of light. In fact, the 2 worlds appeared to be superimposed on top of each other. I could see my parents in the room with the priest at times, and he would sit right on top of one of my guardians. This astounded and upset my young self with its ignorance and rudeness, and I developed a dislike and distrust of him as a result. When the light beings saw my distress on their behalf, they simply glided to my side and comforted me. I was aware of my grandparents' and parents' distress, and while I wanted to go and had made up my mind to go on at least 2 occasions, my concern for my family always pulled me back into my body. I felt terrible when I finally decided to stay. Heavy, sore, chilled, and extremely sad. I felt trapped inside a large piece of bad meat. I felt physically burdened by and separate from my body, and I could see out of my eye sockets as if I were wearing a mask. I was well aware that I was a separate entity from the body in which I was residing. The beings remained with me until the strangeness subsided. I was distraught when the fever broke and I regained consciousness after 2 weeks, and I kept asking my parents where the angels had gone. That's what they must have seemed like to my young mind. They resembled the angel in a print that hung above my parents' bed, but they were far more luminous and powerful. My parents were shocked and immediately called the parish priest, who insisted on performing an exorcism and instructing me not to tell anyone about it. My terrified parents let me tell them my story, and they made me promise not to bring it up again, although I heard my mother and father discuss it with my grandparents later. Many years later, my mother would say that this experience had strengthened her faith in the afterlife. Forbidden to speak of the encounter, I had kept it to myself all these years, despite the fact that it profoundly changed me. My parents reported that as a result of this experience, I became far more compassionate and far less self-centered. After that, I was able to almost read people's minds and became extremely sensitive to others. This is something I still do. I also have very special and intimate relationships with animals. I was actually asked to leave the Toronto Zoo because all of the animals I passed in their enclosures came over to stand in front of me. Many of them tried to touch me by pressing up against the bars or glass. A woman from another family who was there at the same time as me complained that I was hogging the animals and drawing their attention to myself, and zookeepers told me to wait until no one else was present before approaching the animals. As I entered a zoo building or exhibit, they eventually asked me to leave, despite the fact that I was doing nothing but silently approaching the animals. Strangers, particularly children, continue to approach me on a regular basis. People, and even animals, have followed me home for no apparent reason other than to be with me. I've become accustomed to this behavior and no longer question it. I also appear to have a very green thumb, as plants declared dead by florists came to life for me. I just seem to know what to do intuitively. As an adult, I was drawn to the healing professions and spent many years working in operating rooms and other hospital settings. As an applied anthropologist, I now work with adult students who have learning disabilities that make post-secondary education difficult. I'm frequently told that my presence is soothing and that I have a calming effect on others. Since my experience, I've also been visited by animal companions who've passed on several times, and I now get help from my mother, who's also passed on when I least expect it. I feel far more open to life and nature, and the boundary between planes of existence is permeable to me now than it was before my encounter. I awoke from my illness, whatever it was, with the certain knowledge that all life is connected, and since that day, I've lost my fear of spiders and snakes, and I now scoop up all insects and place them somewhere safe when I come across them. Story number 2. I had an epileptic seizure about a year ago. I had no idea a seizure could cause a person to stop breathing. I had back-to-back seizures that were dangerous for reasons I didn't understand. I was aware that people died from seizures on a daily basis, but I was in severe denial about my epilepsy for what I now realize were extremely superficial reasons. Unlike any other seizure I'd ever had, I remember when my circuits crossed. I remember looking down and slipping into the mercury-colored, silver, needle-thin tube that I followed for a fraction of a second, and it felt like my consciousness slipped away at the speed of light. I also heard a horrible sound that sounded like a microphone being plugged into a feedback-prone amplifier. I can only assume that this was the start of the seizure. However, the next thing I experienced did not appear to be in chronological order. I had no recollection of having the previous experience and then being in this other location. After that, I only remembered the sound and the mercury tube. I was only in this state. I knew I was myself, but not as a human with a body. I went through stages. During the first stage, I was completely black, but the black was made up of millions and millions of color pixels. Color was used to create the inky black. I'm having trouble explaining it because some of what I went through has no vocabulary. I had the sensation of a cool, misty wind on my body, but I didn't have one. It was extremely pleasurable, with a loud, pounding sound that reminded me of rock and roll music, and it felt fantastic. This is Mark's idea of heaven, I thought, not understanding what was going on. Mark is a good friend. That was the first indication that I was no longer on Earth. I think I'm dying, I thought, as the strangeness set in. I was taken aback, but realized there was nothing I could do about it. I knew I was dying and that death was final. It was very peaceful and pleasant at this point. This isn't so bad, I reflected. Without further ado, I found myself in the most beautiful, loving place for which I lack the words to express the brevity. The clarity was so surreal that it finally hit me that I was dying. There was no way I could be on Earth. Earth isn't like this. The most lovely cello was playing. I had the impression that I was witnessing the birthplace of music. I was completely engrossed. I knew I was dying at this point, but I was so taken aback and amazed by what I saw that I didn't care. I knew exactly what was going on. You made this. This is your reward. Enjoy it, a male voice said over my left shoulder. While I marveled and drank in the haunting, beautiful music, the same voice behind me whispered, "You're dead." I felt the tiniest rift, like a small wave, rippled through my pleasure, through my non-existent body. That's when I realized I died, I believe. I saw my dog briefly and wanted to reach for him. Without saying anything, the man behind me indicated that I couldn't. That's right. That was years ago, I thought. My understanding was that I'd been there for quite some time, but time did not exist. My dog, on the other hand, is still alive and well and is sitting next to me as I write this. Doctors speculate that my seizure may have stopped at this point due to a significant change in my experience. Matter, molecular matter, did not exist where I'd been. There had never been anything or anyone. I'd never known anyone. No one had ever existed. I was alone, but unconcerned. I had no idea such matter existed. But then I noticed a link between pushing beneath my ribcage on a non-existent body and the appearance of matter. I realized that the harder I pushed, the longer the matter lasted. I had no idea why I was doing it, what it meant, what would happen, etc. All I knew was that I had an insatiable desire to push. The matter I saw gradually assumed the form of a room, but it was not the room I was in. According to the doctors, I was attempting to reactivate my diaphragm in order to resume breathing. This makes complete sense to me. My diaphragm ached for weeks afterwards. When I awoke, I realized what had happened. I was overjoyed to be back on Earth. I was overjoyed to have a second chance. I got down on my knees, cried, and thanked God. The same intensity of feeling that I had while dying lingered for a brief moment when I first awoke. The magnitude of my gratitude is incomprehensible to someone who is unfamiliar with the intensity of feelings during an NDE. I often wonder why I didn't have a life review, a tunnel, a light, or any deceased relatives, all of which are common elements of an NDE. However, I'm eternally grateful to God for his gift. That day, everything changed in an instant. I'm not the same person I used to be. It hadn't been a year yet, and every day is a new learning experience as I try to figure out who I am now, but it is much easier than it was before my experience. I'm in love with life. I'm extremely grateful. I'm astounded by the world's and the universe's beauty and perfection. I apologize for feeling sorry for myself prior to my NDE. In some ways, dealing with the aftermath has been difficult, but I would never trade the experience for anything. I liked who I was before, but I really like who I am now, because I believe God is in everything and everyone. I feel compelled to honor all things and people all of the time. It takes no effort. It is simply who I am. I have a real ability to live in the moment, which was something I'd heard about but couldn't apply until the NDE. Relationships come first, so no matter what responsibility or task I have, a relationship requirement will always take precedence over any deadline or task. I savor every moment of every day. My life has changed in almost every way imaginable. I can't think of anything that hasn't changed at this point.